I want to welcome each one of you to this series, Faith Leadership in the Context of Climate Change, and appreciate again your carving out the time from your very busy lives to be here. I would invite you, if you so want to write your name, where you're zooming in from, your position, if you'd like to, in the chat. And later on, when we come to questions or discussion time, you might, say a little more about that if you want to, if it kind of pertains to what your question or your comment would be. So the first session, we focused on better understanding climate change as the context of doing ministry. And to help us do that, we looked at the science of climate change, its causes, its impacts, as well as what we should be doing about that. And we did that by talking to a climate scientist, Dr. Lee Stearns. The second session, we had the Reverend Dr. Greg Hunt with us to talk about the biblical, theological, and ethical perspectives on climate change and creation care. And that kind of laid an eco-theological grounding for our ministry. And so today we have the privilege of having Dr. Rachel Wheeler with us to talk about eco-spirituality and nurturing spirituality and faith practices in the context of climate change. Dr. Rachel Wheeler is Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Portland, Oregon. She teaches courses on Bible, Christian spirituality, eco-spirituality, and spiritual practices. She earned a PhD in Christian spirituality from the Graduate Theological Union, Berkeley, California. And her other degrees reflect interest in monastic studies, literature, and music. She has a particular interest in the so-called desert Christians who lived in the Egypt, Palestine, and Syria during late antiquity, and has written about that. And her recent books have included Ecospirituality, an introduction, and Radical Kinship, a Christian spirituality. So we're so appreciative to have her with us today. She will speak about an hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for us to engage with one another, asking her questions or making comments or other thoughts we might have that were elicited by what she has to say. But during the presentation, if you could just keep yourself muted out of consideration for others and also because we're recording the session. But then during discussion time, you can unmute yourself and make your comment or ask your question as we engage together in this conversation about this important topic. So we welcome you, Dr. Wheeler. We're really delighted that you're with us, and we look forward to what you have to share with us.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you everyone for being here on this October 14th. And I'm going to start sharing my slides here. But what I'd like to start with is something I start with a lot of my classes in the semester, which is just a little meditation. So I invite you to get however comfortable you like. If you want to close your eyes, if you want to go off camera for a little bit, whatever makes you feel comfortable as you listen to my words. And I put the picture of the book that this comes from, Rooted and Rising, on the screen for you if you want to know about where this meditation comes from. And I think you'll hear from Leah Shade later in this series. So this is one of the edited volumes that she's made with Margaret Bullitt Jonas. So it's called Kinship with Creation. Many of us experience Earth and other creatures as entities that are separate from us. Many of us, especially we who are city dwellers or who spend hours every day on a screen, feel no particular connection with the living world around us or with the other beings with whom we share this planet. Yet the insights of science accord with the wisdom of religion. Human beings do not exist in isolation. We exist within an interconnected web of relationships. This short meditation invites us to exercise our imagination and deepen our understanding of our place in the universe. How would our behavior change if we were more keenly aware that we are brother, sister, sibling beings with the rest of life, and that we spring from the same divine source? So notice that as you're breathing in, you are taking in oxygen released by trees and all green growing things. As you breathe out, you exhale carbon dioxide, which in turn is being taken up by trees. Breath by breath, you are exchanging the elements of life with plants. As you follow your breath, let yourself feel your connection to the air, to trees and grass and everything green. Now let yourself feel the weight of your body where you may be seated or standing. Notice your connection with earth. You are as solid as the earth and made from the same atoms of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen making up the earth. To the earth in the end, all our bodies will return. As you feel the weight of your body in the chair or standing, feel your kinship with earth. Now let yourself sense the inner motions in your body. Maybe you're able to be aware of the gurgling in your stomach or the throb of your beating heart. Maybe you're able to sense the circulation of blood as it's moving through your body. Most of the weight of our bodies comes from water, just as most of our planet's surface is made of water. Your blood is mostly water, and the saltwater content of your blood's plasma is the same as the saltwater content of the sea. It's as if within your body you're carrying rivers, lakes, and the ocean. Let yourself savor your body's kinship with all the waters of the world. And finally, get a sense of your body as a whole. We've felt how our breathing connects us with the air and plants, how our bodies connect us with the earth, and how the waters inside our bodies connect us with the planet's waters and seas. All the elements that make up our bodies came from stars that exploded millions of years ago. Your body is made of the same elements, the carbon and nitrogen that circulated through all the creatures that have ever lived far into the distant past, and that will circulate through any beings that inhabit the world far into the distant future. Our bodies connect us to the air and to plants, to the earth, to waters and the sea, to animals and the stars. Let yourself appreciate the goodness of the amazing body God has given you and feel your kinship with the whole creation. Amen. So today that also connects us with one another. So I'm feeling that. As you kind of draw your attention back to the screen, if your eyes were closed, I'm just going to present some material here, as has been maybe your custom, seeing some images accompanying the words of the speakers, and then aim to finish in time for us to have some discussion. And I would welcome hearing how that meditation kind of landed with you this morning, if you're able to share that later. So, as I start, I just want to acknowledge I'm in Portland, Oregon, and there are a bunch of peoples here who have been active for thousands of years, and we often like to acknowledge them when we begin anything here in Portland. And I'll just offer my gratitude for the peoples who've been here again for thousands of years, the Multnomah, the Wascow, the Cowlitz, the Cathlamet, the Clackamas, the bands of Chinook, the Tualatin, the Kalapua, the Molalla, and others along the Columbia River and Willamette rivers here that form the gorge and the basin of the Portland. Why we're called a port? We're a port on a river. So these people are important, remain important in our communities here. And also, I just want to acknowledge to the people who have been at work on the land and caring for it and making it possible for me to do the studies I have done here in Portland and in Eugene, Oregon, and also in the Bay Area where I come from. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history here and just trace my journey a little bit for you so you know who is speaking to you. I was raised in coastal California and Oregon. And as I was thinking about my childhood and young adulthood, the ocean has been such an important factor of my spiritual development. And that's been interesting to pair with my later attraction to the desert, which is an immense land mass, right? That's quite different than the overwhelmingness of what the ocean might feel like. But as a young person, the ocean just really kind of embodied for me the vastness and marvelousness of how God was presented to me and my family and my faith community cultures. Pretty early on in my childhood, I started playing the piano and I started writing poetry, and so the arts became a really important way for me to experience God and to speak about and kind of access that aspect of my life. And then in my college years, I started reading the Christian Desert Fathers and Mothers, as they're known, and that has really shaped my spiritual experience through their lives of simplicity and their contemplative practices. And that even for me went in a little bit to my care for creation and some of the lifestyle ways that I adopted being in my life in response to what I was learning at that time in college around climate change and some of the important things going on in our world. And then as a professional, becoming a teacher, preaching at my church, doing some pastoral care, writing, a lot of these ways were for me to experience God in through my learning and my sharing the learning process with younger people too, who are a different generation now than I am, and to kind of share some concerns and to find that God is continuing to work with me through these young people and their concerns. So that's been really important to me in my more recent work. So just a little bit of an introduction for my journey and who I am and how I'm coming to you today. So as I talk about eco-spirituality and faith practices to nurture spirituality today, I just want to talk a little bit about context. I know you got a really great introduction to climate science in the first session, so I'm not offering that necessarily, but I do want to think about experience and what the experience of climate change feels like, and some of the stories that we tell each other about what's going on. And then just to talk about eco-spirituality as a concept and an idea informing our experiences, going into faith practices, and then just to conclude with a few issues that are on my mind right now. And then I'll bring to you for discussion and maybe a little bit of a solicitation too about what you're thinking about these issues. So in terms of the context, I always like to introduce the work of Joanna Macy. Her work has really informed the way I think about the world that we live in today. She just died in July, a venerable elder in the tradition that she has put together around the work that reconnects. Hopefully some of you have run into her work before. I'm just going to talk about the three stories of our time pretty briefly, the way she describes them, just as a way for you to understand where eco-spirituality emerges from in my thinking and the work that I do. So she talks about three stories, and each of the images on the screen kind of detail aspects of these different stories. and then I'll go into them a little bit more specifically with words from her work. Again, this is pretty widely accessible online. If you just look for work.that reconnects.org, you'll find some of her work and the framework she suggests. So one of the stories that she describes is just the business as usual story, and she briefly describes this as the story of industrial growth society and the European-based colonial empires from which it emerged. It's the dominant enforcing mechanism of a predatory capitalist imperialist economic system. In other words, the corporate financial military industrial complex that perpetuates patriarchy and white supremacy for the profit and power of a few. And there are a few assumptions that kind of undergird this story as a story of business as usual. And they're on the next screen. Economic growth is essential for prosperity. Nature is a commodity to be used for human purposes. Promoting consumption is good for the economy. The central plot is about getting ahead. The problems of other peoples, nations, and species are not our concern. So probably a lot of those things kind of sound familiar. We've probably heard them in our news media or from people who have power that are using that power in ways that maybe aren't helpful for the rest of us. So assumptions undergirding business as usual. The other story is the great unraveling. And I'm a knitter, so I like this image of kind of this real unraveling of a knitted object, because that is something that is not the thing you don't want to have happen with your knitting and with the world that we share, right? But it is the story, as Joanna Macy describes it, told by scientists, journalists, and activists who have not been bought off or intimidated by the forces of the industrial growth society, drawing attention to the disasters caused by business as usual. Their accounts give evidence of the ongoing derangement and collapse of biological, ecological, economic, and social systems. And of course, we can probably think of a lot of manifestations of unraveling. She names a few in her work: economic decline, resource depletion, climate change, social division, and war, and certainly mass extinction of species. And that list, of course, could be added to with a lot of different components that maybe we see in our immediate neighborhoods. I know here in Portland, homelessness is a very big issue. That is part of the unraveling of social systems and infrastructure to support people to be housed. And I know we can see and hear reports of this happening in a lot of different places in our world. Along the lines of just adding to what she describes as unraveling, with the focus on experience and eco-spirituality, especially focusing on experience, I've just noticed this list of new words to describe how people are experiencing unraveling. This is coming out of maybe eco-psychology more, with people noticing that people are experiencing harms in their inner life and their functionability within a world that isn't really working for them. And these are some names for what people are giving to this experience that I find very interesting. Just pre-traumatic stress disorder, so people anticipating that things are going to worsen and feeling kind of the trauma before that actually happens to inform their inability to be functioning in a way that they'd like to. This kind of characterization, especially with young people that are not playing outdoors enough, nature deficit disorder, where we aren't getting enough of our exposure to working in the outdoors or playing or getting to know the unpredictability and the wildness of other creatures and other species. This idea of species loneliness, I think, is intriguing, where humans spend so much time just by themselves or with other humans that we have this existential character to our species experience that just is loneliness, which is different than what our ancestors might have felt in more communication and company with other species. And this idea of eco-anxiety is just concern for the state of the world and feeling anxious about what is unfolding. Climate grief, feeling sadness about what is being lost in our contexts. The word solastalgia being coined by an Australian eco-philosopher who just noticed the mining in his own context was really devastating the landscape of his home. So he felt like there needed to be a new word that evoked nostalgia, but wasn't just about something that was past and gone, but was really about a place-based sense of connection to a home that was being degraded. So he felt like this word needed to inform that experience. And then kind of this last phrase, which I just put up there, is kind of this playful term too, but it is pointing out something that is uncomfortable, this psychic corpus dissonance. And you can probably hear in that kind of a mind-body dissonance. It was coined by two people in the Bay Area that talked about being able in the winter time to go out and enjoy the ocean and the coastal landscape, but knowing in their minds that that wasn't really the season for doing that. So this kind of enjoyment of something, but the guilt maybe that they know they maybe shouldn't be enjoying it. So just giving words to name this new experience that's about something that's unfamiliar but becoming more familiar to more of us. I think maybe it's useful sometimes to have language like that to name our experiences. Two quotes from Joanna Macy that are important to me. This is in her essay, The Greening of the Self, which says, "Don't apologize if you cry for the burning of the Amazon or the Appalachian Mountains stripped open for coal. The sorrow, grief, and rage you feel are a measure of your humanity and your evolutionary maturity. As your heart breaks open, there will be room for the world to heal." And then this other quote about spiritual practice, I think, is really important too for thinking about eco-spirituality. When you look at what is happening to our world, and it is hard to look at what is happening to our world, our air, our trees, our fellow species, it becomes clear that unless you have some roots in a spiritual practice that holds life sacred and encourages joyful communion with all your fellow beings, facing the enormous challenges ahead becomes nearly impossible. So just speaking to the importance of having some practices that root us, that help us to remain resilient, that don't allow us just to kind of function within a dysfunctional system, but that allow us also to have the courage to change the things that we can change about those systems. That seems really important to me in terms of these quotes from Joanna Macy. So having looked at the business as usual model, the story of the great unraveling, we now get to turn to a story that Joanna Macy would encourage us to put more of our energies behind. And that's what she calls the great turning that we're also a part of today at this moment. She defines this as the story of the transition from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. And Thomas Berry, the Catholic geologian, talked about a transition into an ecozoic era where there would be mutually enhancing relations between humans and other species. So I think she's talking about that life-sustaining society, life flourishing. So attitudes shift from exploitation to respect, from extraction to regeneration, from competition to cooperation. More and more people come to see how interwoven we are as peoples and recognize that solidarity with one another is a way through these crises. So we join together to act for the sake of life on Earth. So that's her statement of one story of what's unfolding and the invitation, too, to put our energies behind the unfolding of this story. And she offers a few strategies for how to do this. So here's another image of that spiral with the green blotches kind of naming some of the opportunities that might be where we put our energies, holding actions, structural change, and then shift in consciousness. So I'll just talk briefly about each of these items and then give us a moment to think about where our own energies might be most invited. So holding actions are basically about saying no to things that aren't worthwhile and life-sustaining or conducive to people's flourishing. A famous example probably would be this showing up at Standing Rock and just saying no to the pipelines and just giving that visibility and presence to something that shouldn't be. And this can happen on a smaller scale too, you know, taking boycotts against things that you don't want to participate in, just withholding one's energy from the things that one knows are wrong and unethical and impacting others in ways that are harmful. So that's one option, just to withhold one's energy, to say no to the things that aren't useful. And then the other piece is structural change. So making some alternatives to what's available now. I just drew some of these images from my own context here in Portland of things I find interesting that people are experimenting with. And there are often occasions to form communities. So, like gardens where people are joining to grow things together and enjoy the fruits of their labor from these gardens, the little libraries that are cropping up around the place to share resources in that way. In Portland, there's kind of this new tiny house community that's emerging where people are wanting to create a different kind of footprint in terms of their living space on a smaller scale, and also to create community, living closer together and sharing urban common spaces in a way that maybe some of us don't have to when we have a larger home to live in. And then just other forms of transportation too, beyond the typical. These are just different ways that people are engaging some energies around creating alternatives to what is readily available. And thirdly, so actually after holding actions, after structural change comes this shift in consciousness. And as an educator, I often think that I'm engaged in this kind of piece most myself. And this is a list that I've put together based on Joanna Macy's work, but also based on my own thinking and what I'm reading about where are different ideas percolating that help us inform the way that we're going to be in the world. So definitely in the sciences, the wisdom of science is showing a lot of different worldview changes that might be possible for us. So deep ecology, systems theory, a lot of these different ways of knowing the world in different ways are emerging in scientific circles. Simple living movement, minimalism seems to have acquired some popularity in the world today to just shift the way that we act. Eco-psychology, ecofeminism, different forms of engaged traditions, engaged Buddhism being a really important one, where not just practicing for the sake of practicing, but really engaging one's practice within the community and for the benefit of others. Resurgence of shamanic traditions is happening. In Christian theology, eco-theology, eco-liberation theology, all of these things are kind of yielding new insights and ways of being in the world, which are really important. And then on the bottom, creation spirituality and eco-spirituality. These have had tendrils, I think, throughout history, the last 2,000 years, and yet they're coming to new expression in ways that I think are really interesting, especially as we take note of the great unraveling and what needs to be responded to in our spiritual practices and in our ways of living our faith. So these shifts in consciousness are informing us, helping us make sense of our situation today, but giving us ideas too for how we might be in different ways. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment, having shared these three stories from Joanna Macy's framework. Again, business as usual, the great unraveling, the great turning, and just ask you to think about the ways in which your own work or your own preferences for how you are in the world draw your energies around one of these stories. And it might be multiple stories, and it may be multiple responses within the great turning that your particular energy is drawn. On the next screen, I have some ideas here as I ask this question. How do you feel yourself invited? So holding actions or resisting might be slowing down destruction, protests, direct action. Creating alternative structures might be new ways of doing things. Shifts in consciousness or values. I'll just give you a minute to think about that. Okay, and as I said, I'm placing eco-spirituality in this space of shifting consciousness and values. So I'm going to offer a definition now. What is eco-spirituality? This is drawn from a book I put together that was kind of a textbook drawing from the curriculum I developed for and with undergraduates at the college where I work, which is a faith-based Catholic institution. And this is the definition that kind of worked for most of the students, whether or not they defined themselves as religious or not. So I say eco-spirituality describes the experience of relationship with the sacred in the context of belonging within our earth and cosmic homes. Eco-spirituality encompasses attitudes and practices that enliven our experience of ourselves as members of the earth community, and that activate our ability to live in a manner expressive of gratitude, respect, care, and joy. And I'll just maybe unpack a few things from this definition. The first just being that part of the word eco, referring to the Greek word oikos, meaning home. So this idea of belonging or being at home in the context of Earth and our cosmic home, so the universe, that felt like a really important sensibility to cultivate as a part of eco-spirituality, that we belong here, that we were evolved within the Earth community, so there's a really special intimacy and relationship that we have here that we want to continue to be a part of. And then it just encompasses attitudes and practices. So the world shift that might be kind of contained up here in our heads and in our bodies can be lived out in a way with intention as we think about the choices we make around the food we eat, the clothing we wear, the activities we partake in. All of those things can be a part of and inform the way that we experience ourselves as members of the Earth community. And then those final kind of values, maybe at the very end of this list, gratitude, respect, care, and joy. Those felt like wonderful things to aim for and cultivate together through the way that we are in the world and the way we think of ourselves as belonging here in the world. So that's kind of the anchor, and I'd love to return to that definition too, as in terms of its making sense to you or helping you notice something that's missing in your definition, or maybe there's something in your own understanding of eco-spirituality that isn't named there that would be interesting to return to. I am in the Catholic tradition, so I'm thinking also about Pope Francis's recent, or not so recent anymore. It's almost it's over a decade old now. His encyclical on creation care, Laudato Si. There is a chapter or a paragraph rather in the last chapter of the encyclical where he talks about Christian spirituality in particular, and I highlighted a few phrases from this particular paragraph because they seem to speak to something important to the way I understand eco-spirituality to be. So a prophetic and contemplative lifestyle, deep enjoyment, present to each reality, capacity to be happy, and then grateful. Those words, those phrases really speak to me about the sensibility that is encapsulated in that definition for me of what eco-spirituality is. And then also that image just of moving from kind of an eco-centric perspective or view of ourselves to an eco-centric, where the web of life is kind of a circle and it has us all a part of the whole. That's also something that Pope Francis was talking about when he was critiquing the misguided anthropocentrism of human values and traditions over the last few hundred years. So that seems a really important reminder too of what eco-spirituality might be helping us to live more fully into. He also talks about this notion of ecological conversion And I thought that mapped well onto the ideas of Joanna Macy of kind of turning away from things and turning toward things, and then just like where and how are we turning up? What are we turning up for? Helping us map what our values are and what our energies are for meeting the needs of this moment. So this idea of ecological conversion, really an important key aspect of ongoing spiritual practice. And I did want to point, even as I'm thinking about Christian communities and my own rootedness within Catholic communities, that there are a wide array of people around the world engaged in this work and doing it from their specific geographical locations, but also their cultural traditions and religious traditions. And some of the people on the screen here may be familiar with you, to you or not. On the lower left, Thich Nhat Hanh, a really important component of engaged Buddhism. So, care for the earth being a part of Buddhist meditative practice and mindfulness and care for all beings and cultivating peace. In the middle, Vandana Shiva, who's working in her own Hindu context around food justice and recovery of intimacy with the land and drawing food to feed all people. On the lower right, Wangari Maathai from Kenya, who was mixing maybe and matching her own indigenous Kenyan practice with her Catholic identity. So she is someone that I work with, specifically her work Replenishing the Earth, which I recommend to anyone who wants to read about Christian values and spiritual values informing very hands-on ecological restoration work. She's the founder of the Green Belt movement, which does reforestation in Kenya, but also worldwide. On the upper right, Satish Kumar from kind of the Jain, Hindu, Buddhist context, founder and worker on Resurgence magazine and the Schumacher College, thinks about how to reconceptualize practice within his tradition for encountering the challenges of the unraveling today. And then finally, the upper left, Guatemalan activist Rigoberta Menchú, really important person drawing on the wisdom of her being brought up in a forested, animate worldview to remind us how to care for and enact resistance to the unraveling. So all of these people and many more are engaged in this work of kind of bringing to the forefront how eco-spirituality can be a really important component of our experience to revitalize our courage and our convictions about being present to this moment, even as difficult as it is. So faith practices. To name some of these, I decided as I was putting together some of this presentation to think about them around three definitions maybe or strategies to think about faith practices. And again, I'm talking about my own Christian context here, hoping that is shared with most of you. And if you have other ideas or other experiences from other traditions, you might bring some of those to our conversation after the presentation. But to begin with, I thought just presences of practice, like cultivating the ability to be more present to the rest of the world than the way that our maybe typical faith practices constrain us from being, would be one way of thinking about faith practices. So practices of presence, practices that enable us to kind of green maybe some traditional practices. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. But greening is kind of a verb that's acquired a certain meaning as we think about like changing what we've done before it to have more meaning or more value within the cultural context and ecological context that we share right now. And then finally, some practices of repair. If we're doing some work to change and even undo some of the damage that's already done, how would we be more intentional and explicit about that intention and the kinds of practices we do? So those are the framework that I'm going to offer here to think about a few examples of practices. So to begin with, the practices of presence. I like to think about this quote from Martin Shaw, who's someone who works with mythology and thinking about disciplines and practices and storytelling. This quote I really love from his work, Navigating the Mysteries. Be your naturalness, then commit to the lively disciplines. Such naturalness is calling forth in you. And I love that quote because it's really reminding us that we already have something about our identity as members of this earth community, as earth beings, that draws us into communion with the rest of the natural world that we don't often act on, or we don't always feel like we live in a way where we can act on that. And so any of the spiritual disciplines or practices or faith ideas about how practice might be lived out aren't to be imposed on us necessarily, but are supposed to be reminders that we all have our own natural response to the natural world that we can act upon. And if they suggest ways of being in the world that are disciplines or our practices, then that's good. That's how our practices can evolve for us. So I hope we can keep that in mind as we're thinking about these different ideas for practice. So practices of presence, as we begin here, one of them that's developed is just kind of being out in the natural world, right? And some of this is drawn from the last several decades of just the bathing, forest bathing practice, which originated in Japan in a very highly industrialized context where people were feeling their disconnection from the natural world and feeling like they wanted to get closer to the greenness of their forested spaces. And the more they did so, the more they noticed health benefits and spiritual benefits. So there is a medical research around this practice that talks about how important it is for our living bodies to be in the presence of the natural world. On the left is another strategy that Victoria Loers writes about, which is taking church outside, which is just creating this church of the wild, to be outside and to be reconfiguring our sense of where sacred community is and where liturgy is, where the word is heard and preached. And those are exciting endeavors just to kind of remind us that our presence in the natural world is really important. It's not within houses of worship or church places. There's something vital that can happen beyond those walls. So forest bathing, maybe a more secular version of what Church of the Wild is trying to get at, to actually just expose us into these spaces as a practice of presence. The other framework I want to think about is just this idea of kin-centric eco-spirituality. Enrique Salmon was the person who thought about this idea and this distinction that as we're present to the natural world in ways that are maybe unfamiliar to us because we don't spend enough time outside the way our even recent ancestors would have been doing. A lot of us may be really overwhelmed by the wonder and amazingness of what is out there as we grow more comfortable with it. But his invitation was really to establish more familiarity, to create this sense of kinship where we know the natural world well enough because we spend time to be there with other species, to be outdoors. So we kind of can balance this wonder and strangeness of the natural world, which a lot of eco-theologians hold out to us as a kind of a titillating experience of kind of becoming more excited about the natural world and caring for the natural world. But his invitation was also to just become familiar with it, even the parts that, like our own family members, we don't get along with necessarily, or we dislike qualities of our natural human families, we would become more familiar with all of that. So a lot of our practices could balance that wonder and familiarity, getting to know the ordinariness of the outside world, just as we do our own human family members. And a lot of this pairs well with St. Francis as this patron saint of ecology. His famous Canticle of the Creatures was all about celebrating the kinship of creation, right? So brother sun, sister moon, sister water, all of these aspects of creation that he named as family members. This image on the right is an image of St. Francis I really love. It just has these sacred halos around all the creatures just to remind us of this kind of common quality of the sacred that we share beyond the human. So, other things that I would be encouraging us to think about is just to think about as we grow in familiarity with the outside world through a practice of presence, we see how much we have in common with the natural world. And this too might inform the way we understand ourselves. And there are two sets of words up on the screen here, one drawn from the Christian desert tradition that I study, that just reminds us how often in our classics of Christian spirituality we talk about the natural world in ways that help us understand ourselves. So I'll read this saying and just point out to you that the italicized words at the opening of it are to remind us of this interconnected piece. In the same way that no plant whatsoever grows up on a well-trodden highway, not even if you sow seed, because the surface is trodden down, so it is with us. Withdraw from all busyness into quietness, and you will see things growing that you did not know were in you, for you were walking on them. I love that saying because it does remind us of something about our own inner lives, right? And how we do have to quiet and stop walking on things in order for them to grow. And this is something our ancient Christian forebears noticed because that's what happens in the natural world, right? If you walk on a road too much and walk over the seeds growing there, they're not going to grow. The plants aren't going to grow. So there's kind of a commonality here that has been a part of our religious traditions for a long time because people were familiar enough with what was going on in the outside world and would help them inform what was going on for their own lives. And then this very short poem by John O'Donohue called Fluent. I would love to live like a river flows, carried by the surprise of its own unfolding. That's to me, such a delightful expression of noticing how how a river is, and then expressing some desire within the self of wanting to be like that. So again, like this invitation to become familiar with what the outside world is and how it reflects important things about our own life that we might have become estranged from just because we aren't as familiar and practiced with being with these other parts of the world. A final example here is not a Christian practice necessarily, but it comes again from the work that reconnects that Joanna Macy is a part of. And it builds on just being in council, which of course is a practice that a lot of people, regardless of religious affiliation, have spent time doing in just as a discernment practice. So in this particular practice, there's an opportunity to spend time in the natural world, listening for the voices of other species, and then coming together and giving voice to what has been suggested to you. So it's kind of a practice of radical empathy to listen for and pay attention to the needs of others in the outside world and then come together and share something. And Joanna Macy and her collaborator who put this practice together, whose name is John Seed, an Australian, talked about we would not be able to know these other voices or listen to them if there were not something in us that already knew this. So they were really pointing out this interconnected piece between our human being and these other species of the world, and this invitation to radically live that out together. And then often maybe to support new action in support of what the needs of these other species are. So that's a part of what this practice is. So practices of presence, that's one offering I want us to be thinking about. The second category I'm offering here is practices of greening. And again, just to describe what that verb of greening is referring to, it's really a matter of making sense anew of practices we may already be very familiar with, but just changing them to meet the needs of where we are today in this world we share that is unraveling. So the first example that came to mind for me is something that just concluded, this idea of working into our Christian liturgies a season of creation. And maybe some of you observed this year during the month of September. It starts usually on September 30th, the World Day of Prayer for the Environment, and then it concludes on October 4th, the feast day of St. Francis. So that's 5 to 6 weeks of incorporating aspects of creation into a Christian faith community's liturgy, a worship together. In my Catholic church, this involved lay preaching, so I did one of the Sundays, and then we had some other longtime members talk about the social justice ministry of the last 50 years in the church. So it was kind of a nice way to rehearse our own history as a faith community and what we've been doing, why we've been doing it. This is an ecumenical body of people who've put together the resources for this season. And this past year, the theme chosen was peace with creation. So you can see kind of the symbol that was adopted for this particular season, and the passage from the Bible that was suggested as a way for thinking about the themes that might be incorporated within a liturgical community. So for my community, this is a really important moment for the eco-justice ministry to come into play to support the liturgy team. In my church, we have some really talented musicians and composers who came together to make music and create some original music for us to be singing every week. As I said, lay ministers were preaching on the Sundays. We had a book discussion group after our gathering, and then we concluded with a picnic in a local park. So I have some pictures here of that picnic at the end on October 4th. And this is just a way where an example, I guess, of something that's already set in motion. We all have, practices of coming together as a faith community and doing things together, but in the context of what's going on in terms of the unraveling of our social systems and the degradation of the ecological, it's helpful for us to reconnect in an outdoor space. On the right-hand side, there's a linden tree next to our All Are Welcome banner, and that was something that was blessed during the picnic and then is going to be planted on our church property. So that was a part of something to build into the kind of homemade liturgy for this picnic and outdoor gathering. So that's one example of a greening of something that's already set in motion, but just kind of adopted in a new way to meet the needs of communities. Another greening is just this idea of the Lord's Prayer transposed, I guess, for the needs of a community today. This is by Claudio Carvalhas, who's done a wonderful, two wonderful collections of liturgies, which are just prayers and practices and ways to think about, especially liberation, eco-theology or eco-liberation theology, however we think about that language, to just give different voice to very familiar prayers. So if any of us know the Lord's Prayer already, you'll probably see elements of it in this. I don't think I'll read the whole thing right now for lack of time, but it's just something for us to be thinking about. How are very traditional aspects of our liturgy ways we could green something and create something new out of it that speaks to the needs specifically of our moment today. This is a really beautiful expression, I think, of that. Another example from my context is the examen practice, which this is an ecological version of it, adopted shortly, I think, after Pope Francis's encyclical on creation care. And it just uses the typical movements of that prayer discernment, reflection practice, but then gives new words to the practice to kind of encourage creation care and paying attention to where we may have been attentive to the needs of other aspects of creation or not been attentive, and how to ask for help in moving forward and deepening our commitments to creation care. So again, another example of kind of greening something that's already a practice in a specific traditional context, and then making it more applicable or more meaningful, more relevant for the moment of experiencing unraveling now. A few more examples from my Catholic context. The Green Mountain Monastery in Vermont makes these earth prayer beads, which are really interesting. So, for at least Catholics for whom the rosary is important, this is an interesting variation to incorporate prayers for earth. And then on the right, and this is not necessarily tied to the Jesuit context, but the Stations of the Cross, which are typical maybe in my Catholic context, have been kind of revised to think about how do we create a story of the journey of the universe within this different traditional context. And this is a particular outdoor exhibit and meditation practice of walking around with these different stations and understanding the unfolding of the universe story. And this is drawn from the work of Thomas Berry, and there are other church communities that do it almost on a spiral pattern within a sanctuary indoors. And I find it very inspiring sometimes to just look at different videos online. There are a few, I think, from a Unitarian church in New Mexico that does it every year around the holidays. They do a video of that on YouTube, and it only takes about 20 minutes. It's pretty meaningful to see people doing that practice and just walking it meditatively and placing different candles at different moments at life's evolution throughout time. So really interesting. Again, a greening of something that's pretty traditional, been around for hundreds of years, but now has new language or a new concept behind it to make it even more relevant and useful for people today experiencing disconnection from our natural world. Thinking about greening too, Bible study or preaching, that's what this image suggests. And then a particular text I could point you to if you're interested in doing more study around what would this might look like. Norman Habel's book, An Inconvenient Text, very short text, but introduces a methodology, introduces some of these principles that he names eco-justice principles that talks about reading the Bible, looking for nature's intrinsic worth and purpose, looking for the ways that nature and humans are interconnected and that there's a mutual ethic around custodianship in the Bible, and then places where creation is voicing often resistance or lament or something like that. There are a lot of passages that actually speak to this sensibility. And Norman Habel suggests starting to read in that way and noticing the inconvenient message that might emerge from reading in this way, where other anthropocentric perspectives or damage, things that facilitate damage, get undermined actually in this particular way of reading. So I think that's very exciting. Again, Bible study, hearing the word proclaimed in our faith communities, pretty traditional aspects of our practice, but they can be greened in a way that do help people to connect better, to make more sense about how they might be active in a way for supporting creation care. This other one I have not seen in Christian traditions yet, but I find it such an intriguing example. I wanted to include it today. And this is kind of a protest action. Sometimes I'm not sure that there's actually anything done after tree ordination where the trees function as ordained monks in the Buddhist tradition. But I think this is a very imaginative and useful way for us to think about practice and greening. And in this case, the Buddhist monks are ordaining the trees in order to protect them from being cut down. And there's a way of extending the concern of care and even authority to these trees in these spaces, which I find very intriguing and would love to see Christian ministers think about experimenting in this way. Finally, practices of repair, and I'll just name a few of these since I know we're coming up on the hour. The first one was suggested to me just in changing our language. This is Robin Wall Kimmerer, the ethnobotanist and moss specialist and Haudenosaunee member, and she just says we need to stop using it to speak of nature. That's really easy, I guess, but it suggests a sensibility change as we just drop that objectification in our language. So hopefully that would repair a sense of connection and meaningfulness if we were just careful about the way that we don't use it to speak of nature. I'm going to rapidly move through this to the next one. Getting our hands dirty, creating reparation in our landscapes. This can happen in our church properties, in our homes, our neighborhoods, any of the ways we can do some actual work in the ground. We can also be caring for creatures, equine therapy in particular. And I wanted to share this work of a friend of mine, Melody Escobar, who's written a book about her autistic son, disability, spirituality, and mutual flourishing. And she writes really beautifully about these equine therapy centers where there's sites of transformation for wounded animals, horses in particular, and humans. So this relationship that unfolds for people, especially disabled people who maybe don't have as flourishing human community and companionship as they can with animals. There's a mutuality that unfolds here that is healing for both the human and the horse that is really amazing. And she characterizes that, like I said, as a site of transformation and a sacred space where that can happen, that repair and healing. Other forms of just sharing. I put this because I just mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I wanted to point out her newest book, The Service Berry, where she's just talking about abundance and sharing and different economies of scale. So things that can happen in our own families, our own communities, our neighborhoods, and then up and up and up to kind of transform the default setting that a lot of us operate within in terms of our economy in particular. And then this is a text that I wanted to point out at the very end as we think about practices of repair. It's 20 Principles of Eco-Resilience, and Ruth Roselle said she would send this out to you. So hopefully you have an access to this text. It's also available online. 20 principles that give us really, I think, specific language to talk about what our practices could look like. And I'm going to just name the first 5 of them to give you a flavor for what these are, and if they give you an idea for what kinds of things you might be engaged in your own context. So recognize nature as our guide. Know and align with the movements and patterns of the world. Respect the wild around and within us. Preserve green space and wild places. Come home to where you live. Return to earthly reality in acts of deep homecoming. Build heartsteads, create wisdom circles, and gather around a common purpose. Replace monoculture with polycultures. Welcome in who or what has been silenced or excluded. So those are just some examples, and there's a long list. There's 20 of these things that just for me give me ideas for how I might be in my life in a different way and create some practices that change who I am, again, at different scales. So quickly, the 3 issues that I wanted to end with, since we're getting close here, and again, this might just spark our conversation too as we go into the next half hour. Eco-justice, something I'm starting to call eco-spiritual fragility, which I would love to hear a response to from you. And then just artificial intelligence. I know that's dominating a lot of our conversations right now. So the first one, eco-justice, a lot of spiritual practice often is about the flourishing or the well-being of the practitioner themselves, and sometimes it can seem that that's exclusive to a better functioning of the community they're a part of, right? And so this is a concern that I think people do have, that as we focus just on our own well-being or flourishing, that we aren't taking care of the communities we're part of. So eco-justice just feels like a really vital component to keep attached and very present to whatever decisions we make about our own eco-spiritual practice. And there is some language people are starting to use around not distinguishing a difference between these two things, making them kind of collaborate and integrate. So thinking about first level and second level practices where 1 and 2 support one another, practices we do for ourselves that enable us to be of better service to our communities, the services that we provide to our communities, and allowing us to do the healing and maintain the well-being that we need for ourselves. So there being a reciprocity between the 2 levels. Some people are using language around engaged spirituality, so thinking about things that aren't just for us, but that engage us with our communities. Some people are using language of second and third wave spirituality, so thinking about the different groupings of people and aspects of life that might become more and more pressing that we respond to as part of our spiritual practice. And then just this language too about sacred activism, just making our advocacy and our presence in our communities, our political action, any of those kinds of things that we're engaged with as a part of our spiritual lives, and not making it distinguished necessarily, kind of all of those things folding together. That's a really important component, I think, for eco-spirituality to be for us to be conscious of if we're concerned about eco-spirituality. The second issue that's still in my mind is just this kind of definition or this thing I'm playing around with around eco-spiritual fragility, which I'm defining as just intolerance of painful feelings of guilt and sadness at human impacts on the natural world, which we might call denial, defensiveness, spiritual bypassing. We can unpack that more in the future if anyone's interested in exploring this a little further with me, but it's a concept that I'm thinking about that we need to be aware of. That ties into what I just named as kind of the importance of maintaining a commitment to eco-justice with whatever eco-spiritual practices we adopt. And finally, just this idea of AI and the concerns that it has in a lot of spaces. As I mentioned, I'm an educator, so conversations about the usefulness or the lack of usefulness of AI in our educational and learning spaces remains of interest to me and concern. Will it help us reground or will it keep us distracted? I asked EI this question, and I'm using EI because that's the name Vanessa Andriotti uses for this particular entity she trained called Aiden Cinnamon Tea, who is supposed to help us deprogram our expectation that AI should do everything for us. So often this particular entity will tell us to go outside or to give us a mindfulness practice or an embodiment ritual or something to put into a living practice, something that we're thinking with. So this is the answer that was provided by Adian Cinnamon Tea. AI can reground or distract us. It depends on the relationship we cultivate. When we meet it as a mirror for our craving for control, it will feed that craving and pull us further from Earth. But when we meet it as a compost heap, something to turn, tend, and learn from, it can help us notice our entanglements and remember the intelligence that already lives in soil, body, and breath. AI isn't the teacher or the enemy, it's the echo. What we hear in it depends on how quietly we're willing to listen. So I found that intriguing to think with. And again, welcome any of your ideas as you're thinking about these things too. And in conclusion, I just have an image there of the book that I wrote, Ecospirituality, around this topic, and some of my favorite texts that I drew ideas for this presentation. Thank you, everyone, and I apologize for going a little longer into our discussion time, but I hope to hear a lot of great ideas from you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler. Wow, so rich and so much that you shared with us. So we do have some time now to talk together, to reflect, to ask questions about some of the things that Dr. Wheeler brought up to us, maybe to share some experiences related to some of the things, the practices that she mentioned. So if you have something you'd like to share, I would invite you to unmute. We're a small enough group, we can just do that and engage in conversation together. Sue, go ahead.
I just have a couple things, but I want to say thank you for giving us the language of what we're feeling, because I think that's really important from a pastoral care perspective, because I know I feel some of these things myself. But I also wanted to share the experience that our congregation had in celebrating. We did a Sunday of the season of creation, and we had a service on October 5th to kind of close it out. And we used the liturgies, kind of mapped it into our own order of service. I worked with the children's ministry teachers to make the dove wreath that was part of the resources, and it is now hanging from our cross at the altar. Um, and the choir sang a song. It was just wonderful. And the way I preached on Isaiah is we kept the kids in church because they normally go to children's church. I started by asking the kids questions, and they pretty much led the entire discussion. And it was so uplifting to hear how they've been learning about how to care for one another and the earth and just being very much aware. Um, so if anyone wants to try doing anything like that, it was just really uplifting for the congregation to participate in that way. And so I'm very lucky to have Noni, who is in this call, who has built our creation care team, and I'm also getting some lot of great ideas from today to continue to build that ethic of caring for nature into the things that we do at church. And I'll just say one more thing. I like the idea of not calling nature it. One of the things that I arrived at when I was in seminary is to consider the earth my neighbor. And I know I'm not the first person to think about that, but when we build that into our idea of caring for the neighbor, I think of the earth in that way. So thank you again, Rachel.
Maybe I
Yeah.
could jump in if that's okay. I really appreciated the idea that you briefly mentioned about the fragility in these conversations. And I've been thinking about, I didn't have the word for it, but thinking about that challenge in our last few sessions as well, because I feel like the guilt and overwhelm can be such a wall for people. Like, even in myself, how that the feeling that, you don't know enough, you can't do enough ever, or like that we don't, maybe that we don't have the resources to do all that we should be doing, or we also want to be a non-judgmental space. And sometimes, honestly, the eco movement can feel like judgmental, and I'm not using the right kind of coffee cups or diapers for my kids, or whatever. Like, so just I would love to hear more of your thoughts of how to respond to that, because of course we need to work on the fragility within ourselves, and talking about the grace of God in this process, while also being willing to challenge ourselves, but not make it like a bar to entry for those conversations that you already need to know a certain amount or whatever. So I guess I would just love to hear a little bit more what you've been thinking about that topic. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that and noticing it already. Yeah, I think for me it might have started with judgment because it does feel like there is judgment or implicit competition, I guess, around trying to be the most informed or the most aware of the impacts of the different things that we're involved with, unintentionally, I'm sure, and in most cases. And just for me, the unwillingness to kind of go there myself and to notice that even though I do a lot of things that I'm pretty proud of, it's not enough, right? Of course it's not enough. So learning to kind of and learning maybe from people I wouldn't have expected to learn from, that like there's not this purity around the way that we can think of our eco-spiritual being, that we're all pretty compromised, and that's a real hard thing to face, I guess. And so, yeah, naming for me something around the eco-spiritual fragility felt important to give words to that experience of discomfort and not coming to terms with it. And I'm probably still struggling with it, to be honest. And maybe it's not exactly the right term, because I don't want to co-opt the idea of white fragility or dismantle anything about how meaningful that is around addressing white supremacy. But there is there is like a lot of focus in a lot of the spaces I'm a part of to focus on abundance and flourishing and the good stuff we want to create. And so to me, that felt like it might bypass some of the real gritty stuff we have to come to terms with that, yeah, are uncomfortable that we're a part of just because we're part of systems that are larger and more powerful than we are. So that's, yeah, I appreciate you naming some of the God's grace being a part of that, or there's something else that is working within us to soften our hearts to be able to look at that and address it and to be, to be brave and acknowledging that we're a part of things that aren't the way we want them to be. But I don't really have strategies because I think I'm just working on it in myself, and I don't yet know what conversations with other people look like around that. I know it with from my students, so I work primarily with a faith community here in Portland that's Catholic, and a lot of them are pretty willing to look at this stuff and acknowledge their own complicity. But a lot of younger people feel like they've inherited a lot of that. So there is, for me, a generational change that's interesting to work with, and to feel like sometimes that does make them very judgmental because they don't feel as responsible as others. And so for me, it's more maybe coming to terms with their judgment of me and saying, yeah, as much as I feel like I'm trying to do, I'm still very much part of the problem. And how can I acknowledge that and move with you in a way where I'm not seeming like a barrier to you? Yeah, I don't know if that expresses at all what I'm trying to grapple with because it is really challenging. And yeah, I don't know, but I'm just sharing my own experience, I guess.
Don, you wanted to say something.
I'd rather hear what other people say, but um, I like the concept you had of holding actions, and it really is what we're doing right now because we are not winning anything. We're simply finding moments where we can stop something bad from happening to nature, and it's just a momentary small victory in a war that we're losing pretty badly. Um, I your your concept of worship in the wilderness, worship in nature. I I love that and I use it, but I think how far I have to drive before I don't have highway noise or construction noise or these kinds of things that really make a difference in what I can experience when I'm in these settings. So I guess the scale is the question I have. Is there the potential to scale up the concepts of eco-spirituality that you are giving to us into more and larger and greater um, impact in the world we live in?
Do you think there are, Don?
I think there has to be,
Yeah.
or we will not be who we are anymore.
Mm.
Well, and I think engaging, we're together as faith leaders, really trying to engage faith leaders in this effort to do so much of what Dr. Wheeler suggests in terms of greening traditions and um, pastors, faith leaders, and other places have impact on how their congregations then view things. So I think this group is very important, and each person here kind of has that ripple effect to those. But yeah, it's a big challenge, I think, Don, that you're bringing in front of us for spirituality to, in a sense, kind of shift in a major way to include all of creation and yet I think you're right. We need to, right? This is the big issue of our day, really. Yeah. I did want to mention one thing too. Megan brought up, we had a climate conference a couple weeks ago that that perhaps some of you listened to the main speaker, Dr. Cynthia Moldavetta, and she also emphasized this ethical dilemma that we live within, and was very, forthright about it, and kind of transparent about how, really kind of how hard it is that no matter what we do, there are, we're in systems, we're all caught in systems that that are are destructive to the environment. And so we do live with that kind of pull. We can do a lot personally, and I think we need to, and collectively that makes a difference. But then, of course, we need to advocate for systemic change, and yet we are caught in the middle here of still being engaged in these systems that are destructive. So yeah, I think just even maybe voicing that ethical, I don't know if her word was dilemma, that's maybe more how I think of it in my own life, trying really hard and yet still participating, recognizing that that's our reality as we're in transition, we're shifting, or hopefully we're shifting from one story to a different narrative. But I think, Don, you point out, that needs to happen. And I think this group here and other faith communities are important for that happening.
I didn't mean to be so negative. There, there are wonderful things going on. We are developing renewable energy resources that are going to make a huge impact, and economically, it's making a lot of sense. So that change is happening slower than it should, but it's happening, and I think we're making strides in research about how we produce our food that can, you know, so much of the land that we have on this earth is to produce food for the growing populations of this earth. But there are things we can do to be more efficient on the land we have and to find alternatives to growing on land that we can still provide the energy resources we need for people. So, there are things going on, but and I love your presentation about changing the attitudes of how we look at this earth. I think it's just critical to where we are. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of scale, maybe I could just add one thing when you brought that up, Don. It brought to mind this concept that Deborah Reinster writes about, and I'm going to put her name in the chat with her book, Refugia Faith. Maybe some of you know of that book, but she talks about this ecological concept of refugia, which kind of makes sense here in Oregon because we have Mount St. Helens, and after it erupted, this is a concept that ecologists used for talking about the regeneration of the landscape so quickly after the volcanic devastation. And it happened because these refugia were there, which are just little pockets of resilience and seeds and holding on to things. And because those were happening in dynamic places across a landscape, they connected more quickly. So I find that kind of interesting in the way she characterizes change. And sorry, I have a kitty wanting to come up here. She talks about change and thinking about how we all are doing our own part where we are, and then we connect, right? We find hubs and connect, and then that fertilizes, I guess, the space between, and it regenerates more quickly and more, maybe even more abundantly than it might have otherwise. So that, for me, that's kind of a hopeful thing too, that as we're each doing the work where we are, we're connecting and creating avenues and corridors of possibility between us, which are interesting, where spirit can work in ways that we can't fathom. It's an interesting concept to think about.
Carolyn, you're trying to say something.
So in changing attitude, I think we've over the centuries misinterpreted interpreted what God said in Genesis. God didn't tell us to dominate the world. God was telling us to be a servant of the world, to
Stewart.
steward, yes, to join with God to take care of the world. God doesn't give us this. We are stewards of it. And the same with our life. Our life, we're stewards from God to take care of ourselves. So we take care of ourselves, we take care of the earth as stewards, not as owners.
And as part of, I love the second creation story where the human is made from the soil, right? So that's like the interbeing that we actually are, the earth we're taking care of. So it speaks to what you're describing, Carolyn, taking care of ourselves and the rest of creation because we're all a part of it.
I did love some of the spiritual practices. The first one was wonderful for our interconnecting with the earth as we started our time together. And I like this ecological examine. I think that could be really, really lovely to practice on a regular basis. And I think this developing the spirituality that is connected to the earth and I think it's really important to sustain us in our other efforts for eco-justice. Um, and I guess you pointed that out with a quote. Um, but there are many discouraging things. And I find that nature kind of renews that. I live much of the time we have a little house on the lake. And so when I've been on the screen too long, which is about every hour, if I'm able to, I go and walk through my yard, and which passes by kind of a little bit of a cove where the lake is. And I find that whatever is going on, my mind clears and I calm, it nature is so renewing that to bring that into our spirituality really makes a difference in living it out and giving us strength, I think, or focus to do it. So I think it's such an important part. Were there other, we just maybe have a couple minutes left, other ways or practices that some of the rest of you are finding nourishing, or any other comments as well to what Dr. Wheeler has presented?
I've talked too much today, but plant a native plant and see what comes. It can be a wonderful surprise.
Yeah, that's true.
As I have participated in these talks, I'm more aware. I mean, I know it's all over scripture, the beauty of nature and the parables with nature and so on and the desert fathers and mothers. That's beautiful. And I was reading the Didache, and the Eucharist is full of, the going back to natures and the wheat and so forth and so on. So um, as I think about share all of this with my own community, these have been these talks and your in particular, and I loved the way you began with the meditation. I was thinking, okay, how can I fit this into my community, and so on. So I truly appreciate all that you have shared with us and everyone else as well, and just have been deeply fed. And I loved someone mentioned the terms, the vocabulary. I love that radical empathy one. And all of the rest, I'm still thinking about all of these. So just want to say thank you for helping to break this out more and helping me as I try to share as well. Um, I wanted also to mention that in Spanish, um, as I'm sure most of you know, we have no it. Really, yeah, nature is a she. So that was interesting, you know, that in English, of course, I have to go back and forth. So I was just thinking myself, I wonder if when I'm thinking in English, if I do think of it as an it as, you know, the she as an it. So that was just an interesting piece for me as well. But yeah, it is a she in Spanish. But thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for those words. Um, and that's interesting. Dr. Wheeler, is there any final word you'd want to say as we're closing?
Oh, no, I think just a thank you to everyone for being here and sharing this time. Really appreciate being able to do this.
Well, thank
Thank
you so
you.
much. And there were a few that I think about 4 people had other meetings to go to that signed up a little early. I actually know they're quite involved in doing stuff in their communities, but all mentioned, you know, how filling this was, how helpful this was. So we really, all of us, thank you so much for this time spent with us and the resourcing you have done for our future thinking and practices. So we will meet again as a group in 2 weeks. So not next week, but on October 28th, same time, same Zoom link. And as Dr. Wheeler mentioned, we will be hearing this time from Dr. Leah Shade, who will be talking about pastoral leadership in the context of climate change, preaching, and then kind of along with that, the teaching, leading worship, talking about climate change, dealing with conflict. It all kind of is together, actually. She's going to be talking about that. She's written a book on climate crisis preaching quite a long time ago, and more recently, the Purple Church, so kind of dealing with politically diverse congregations. So I think that'll be a very interesting session as well. So I hope you'll plan to join us. So thank you again, Dr. Wheeler. Thanks